To die for Christ, loving Christ, means to go to glory, means to go to Christ.
Hi there, I'm Aaron Edwards.
Hi there, I'm Nathan Paler. We're just doing. Well, Aaron, do you want to explain what this is?
This is a commentary which they would have known if they clicked on commentary on the DVD menu.
I was more referring to the fact that there are two commentaries on the DVD menu. Why have they clicked on this one, and what have they got in store?
Well, tonight, kids, we've got in store for you a delightful and potentially difficult theological commentary between me and Nathan here, which is going to be very difficult to resolve at some point, maybe. But we're going to hope to enlighten you as to what went behind a lot of the stuff you heard in the video, if it was of any benefit to you.
Theologically and biblically speaking. So this is where we're going to go into some detail, flesh out a few details.
So, what do you mean by biblically? Just explain everything you mean by that
This could go on for quite some time. I'm looking forward to this.
Good.
It should be good. Okay, we're going to start this straight away because we don't like to last too long. That is, if we can operate the DVD system. And here we go.
So here's Heather walking along the road. That's my sister. Oh, am I going into this? The problem here is the boundaries between the aesthetic and the theological commentaries. Are they going to overlap? Basically, the idea behind the kind of symbolism of this was that it was to connect with more my monologues than yours, wasn't it, Nathan?
Yeah.
That it was a kind of a spreading of the concept of beauty in the mundane. So,
although as we'll see in mine, we do feature the flowers, which will appear later in the video, and we'll explain the existential crises that occurred as a result. But we'll get onto that later.
Yes, we will. There is a link between the two, but that's something else we'll come to. But basically, it's about she's a character who simply the really beautiful thing I think about it is good art anyway, but is that she as a character is somebody who is doing nothing else but spreading like a concept of beauty in everyday life. So there's no other reason for her to get on the train and make this journey. And now we'll listen to Vox Pops. So
yeah, the Vox Pops are really interesting because for the past couple of videos, especially in our first one, which if you're not familiar with what we're talking about, Aaron and I have made two videos in the past, both for Chester CU at the carol services every Christmas. And for the past two videos, we've always tried to fit in a bit of apologetics, that is defending the Christian faith. We've tried to, maybe argue a bit with the interviewees. This time, it features a real break from tradition in that sense. We don't really do that. We're literally just
gaining quotes and quotations, fodder for the video, really.
Which was unfortunate in many ways because it did, as we'll discuss more in the aesthetic commentary, it did lead to some really bad Vox Pop sources. We didn't really get much. We're back to Heather now.
Back to the Heather thing. Yeah, as I was saying, it's almost in my mind when we were thinking about this kind of character, I was thinking of someone a bit like Amelie. You've seen the film Amelie?
I have. Well, it could be a lie.
You'll have seen it by the time the DVD comes out.
Yes.
And it's just, there's something that everybody is drawn to about that character whenever I've seen anyone who's seen that film. Just because of the way that she sees the world and the way she goes about her things is so different to the way that the world, the machine of the world, you might say, seems to work. The kind of pragmaticism of just going about your life and not actually reflecting on anything that makes the world so wonderful. So every kind of scene that happens,
so you're looking forward to Christmas?
She's just a ray of light in it.
Yeah. What's your favourite thing about Christmas?
It's me talking to some cute little girls there, and their mums just on the side. You were saying you thought this would be it's almost like propaganda, the kids are on their side.
Essentially so. You get the kids on your side, you get the women on your side, and with the women on your side, they control the men. So we've got everyone in that one little thing. But we're getting into somewhat aesthetics there, aren't we? But however, you did have to. No, you know what? I'll save that little tidbit. You just wait and see for that scene in the aesthetic commentary. We've got some things to say. The vicar. Now, this guy said some really good stuff. Now, this was interesting because we actually the whole point of our video. Well, one of the whole points was the role of Jesus in suffering. One of the whole points. We say one of, and we'll get to that later. But this guy really encapsulated that point for us, articulated it very well. Did we use his footage? No, we didn't.
Of course not. We thought, you know, let's be articulate ourselves and not let the people in the vox pops be articulate. That's the thing. That was almost the point. I guess we don't want to talk about the florist incident.
No, we will not. We'll talk about that in the aesthetic. But Aaron, theologically speaking, what do you think the point of Heather is? Because there's a lot of people saying, what is the point of Heather? What is the point of, not of Heather as a person, but what's the point of including this? What is it all about?
As I've said, yeah, she's basically she's leaving marks of reflection and beauty in back to the vox pops thing now, aren't we? So we'll stay on Heather. This guy's not with all the vox pops sort of thing. Basically, Heather is she's spreading that kind of message. She's almost like an evangelist, you might say, for beauty itself. So she's doing these kind of things that you shouldn't really do, that the world doesn't really. I don't know, it's a bit weird. It's very strange for her to do it, and if somebody did do that, then that'd be weird. The weirdest thing is, when I showed this to my mum, who isn't at this moment, is not, I wouldn't call herself a Christian in the evangelical sense.
He's pretty impressive.
Or maybe in any sense. She grew up Catholic, but she shouldn't have any kind of religious reason to do it. But she actually did that exact thing. When we showed her the video, she said there's one New Year's Eve when she went through town and she bought some white roses and she put one on the windscreen of every car that she saw on the way home, and it's completely unprompted.
It's fantastic.
It's really beautiful. It's such an amazing coincidence.
Who's probably taller or shoulder rather than fat.
Yeah, it's fine. We'll go back to the flowers later because I've got a few things to say about that myself. But for the sake of relevance, Aaron, your monologue is split into two bits, and this is the first half. What was the point of this first half?
Basically, it's to act as an actual genuine link into what we're saying. So we needed the material to work from a Christmas perspective, and Father Christmas is like the epitome of that. And the way that I wanted to start the discussion off was with the existence of God, because especially in our society we have an enlightenment perspective which seems to dictate the way that we think about things like logic and empirical truths, and certainly the way that we see God. So the idea of God is just a sociological construct that we're kind of over now, italicized over. We're kind of, we got over it, like it was just the stupid kind of medieval people who believed in all that kind of stuff, and it's all fairy tales. Now we're very rational beings, and we're over that, and we know what the science has proven, that there's no God. And it's the default. But the thing is, it's the default perspective to think that God doesn't exist. Is the kind of thing that we're dictated to, and I'm trying to use, I guess, this symbol of Father Christmas, and it's exactly the same concept almost. You get told it when you're a kid, and then when you grow older, you grow out of it. So it was the same for me. I was told about God when I was a kid, and I didn't care when I was older. It's exactly the same kind of construct in a way, and that's the kind of link I'm trying to make with God.
I find it really interesting that we're using Santa Claus, because it's one of the. Obviously there's been a rise in atheism. It's usually very simplistic atheism, and one of the arguments that this simplistic atheism, hosted by thinkers, italicized, such as Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris, and etc. One of the ideas is that Santa Claus is nothing, is no different in any real sense to God. I almost did it myself there. And I find it really interesting that you actually tackle that head on. And it's actually a theological feature of this video, and it's going to arise especially in the over half of mine section, where we really do try to encapsulate the argument from the other side. What would you say the point in that was?
Of the Father Christmas thing?
Of the decision to represent the other side, so to speak.
I see. To represent the kind of negative aspect.
Yeah.
Well, I think that was almost to act as in a sense, in any, say, academic work or any essay, any good scholarship would seek to have an opposing side and consider the other side and argue the very best possible case for your opponent in order to kind of overcome it. But so if you can get inside the head of your opponent, as it were, then and actually understand fully where they're trying to understand fully where they're coming from, saying, look, I completely, this is how I could see your perspective. This is how God could be seen. This is how religion could be seen. This is how everything could be summed up. And actually, it's a load of rubbish. What you think? And then, but when you fully understood their point, if you just say it's a load of rubbish, I don't believe you because the Bible says, or because this is what I think, or something, that's not really very convincing. And I think, yeah, so
it's one of the temptations of writing or formulating a polemic, isn't it? Writing a response like that, an intellectual response, is to kind of denigrate your opponent's argument, or to ignore your opponent's argument, or to not represent your opponent properly. And I think that there's a genuine intellectual challenge if there's any atheists or agnostics or non-Christians watching this. And, you know, we make no presumptions, we make no pretensions that you're going to somehow fall and have a Damascus Road experience. But what you can't ignore is that we're familiar with what you're familiar with. And there's a genuine sense in that. There's a genuine reality there that you've got to deal with. We're familiar with the problem of evil. We're familiar with these atheistic arguments. And we're still Christians. What is that about?
The other thing is, it really doesn't get that much more complicated than this. And I would actually argue that even though many atheists would watch this and go, that's not well represented. Ultimately, there is not a more nuanced or detailed, like there's no further that the problem of evil question can go, and that is the main question that is offered. The main question is offered like, God can't exist because of these kind of reasons, and this is why you shouldn't be someone who seeks after God or thinks about anything spiritual because it doesn't exist. And these are the arguments we've given you, and I don't think it gets any further than this. You can literally argue academically further, you can make it sound a lot more complicated, but ultimately this is the extent to which it is. And to almost going back to what we were saying about arguing the case, the film reference just came into my head. Remember, have you seen 8 Mile, Nathan?
I have not seen 8 Mile. I'm obviously not a hip-hop fan as much as you are.
Fairly hip-hop fans listening. When in 8 Mile he does the same. He knows he's going to get. He has his battle rap with someone. Oh, the Brothers Gospel rap. And the guy, he knows the guy's going to rip on him. In italics.
You're so gangster, Aaron.
He's going to rip on him. And so what he first does in his rap, he goes first, which is negative because obviously you have the first one and he gets the second. He just takes the mick out of himself for the majority of the time, and then he does a little bit at the end. So he does all the other guys' work for him, but he's still going to win. So the other guy gets the mic and he's like, oh, what have I got to say? You've already said it all for me, but you almost in a better, more articulate way, and yet you've still proven it to be rubbish. So. Also,
never stop to look at the beauty of it all.
Fitting it in. It's good. Didn't you do your dissertation?
I did. And that actually C.S. Lewis said that it's the best.
What, your essay?
Yeah, C.S. Lewis came back from the dead and he said, Aaron, do you know what? I know I lectured on Paradise Lost for years and I wrote many commentaries on it, but your essay has just brought in so... I know you quoted me a lot, but it brought in so much. Fantastic. Anyway, oh my goodness.
Yeah, man, we've missed so much. I know, but we're getting there. Okay. First and foremost, let's do it really quick. What are you trying to say? There's that really great line that is, can we still ask questions and believe whilst asking them? Summarize your thought, your intentions behind that in a good 2 minutes.
Oh, good. I like 2 minutes. Well, basically, that's the idea of asking, of contemplating and thinking around a subject and asking these questions and trying to break down and re-envision the way we think about things. So that's what philosophy essentially is. So philosophy is asking why we do things. So you walk down the road, you don't think about why you walk down the road, and philosophy asks, why are you walking down the road? Do you need to go to this place? Do you need to go to this shop? Why do you want to go to this shop? Why do you want to buy this thing? Blah 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 blah. And so the reason that some philosophy is very dangerous is because it doesn't have any framework, it doesn't have structure, it doesn't ask why, we're asking the question. It just says we will ask questions and that will be God, that will be it. I mean, by God I mean concept of like the absolute. It's like the question is gloried as this fundamental thing that must be asked always ask questions. But I'm trying to say that there must be a framework for that. And if you look at a lot of kind of emerging church stuff, which me and Nathan are very familiar with, we might get into that stuff later. It's good, but sometimes it asks the kind of questions that don't it's not that they shouldn't be asked, but they're not asked with any kind of caution or framework as to where I'm going with this question. Where does this lead me? Where's the progression? Am I just asking questions that are going to destruct and deconstruct myself, deconstruct my faith, and then leave people in these kind of shattered wrecks nowhere? Actually, that's not how it should work, because you've just decided the question has that kind of power, and it doesn't. Otherwise, you could accept the question that Satan asks in Garden of Eden: did God really say that you shouldn't eat from the tree? Is that a good question to ask? Well, actually, no, and we know from the rest of human history that it isn't. But somehow we've decided in our postmodern generation that all questions are valid, all questions are allowed to be asked, and actually that's not necessarily true. But I mean, it's not, you can ask them, but as I said, believe as you ask them. Think about a framework for why you're asking it, and just be aware of that, I think.
And can I also add, not to that tangent, I'm moving on. I really like that thing about that C.S. Lewis quote about fairy tales. Someday you'll be old enough. And there's something genuine in this that I don't know if it was what you were trying to get at. I think it might have been, or at least in part. That is the power of the myth, and not in the sense that the myth is something that's completely false. It's entirely different. It's precisely because it's true. Like, the most real stuff in life is not necessarily the cold, hard facts of naturalism, cold, hard facts of scientific empiricism. And that's quite a basic philosophical point, but I think it's one that's very useful. Fairy tales are so incredibly useful for telling us who we are and what we are, and it's quite indicative of Richard Dawkins' lack of sophistication, that he apparently, according to you, is writing a book denouncing them.
Yeah, the quote that I had there is from an interview I found online about him talking about this new book about how children shouldn't be taught fairy tales because they're unscientific, anti-scientific, and they teach them a wrong worldview. And actually, a guy called G.K. Chesterton, who is amazing, who C.S. Lewis is, we'll forget about the fact the images don't correlate to what we're saying. Basically, C.S. Lewis is completely beholden to Chesterton in most of the way he thinks about things, I think, and certainly about fairy tales. So that quote about fairy tales is a very Chesterton-like phrase about the idea that the most real things we know about life actually don't come from science, the things that say these are really real. Actually, fairy tales teach us so much more about the human condition, and the fact we're drawn to them, even in things like chick flicks or anything about a happy ending. It's interesting that even though happy endings don't happen as we've discussed later in the conclusion, we are drawn to them. There's something about them that is incredible, and there's something we'll never get over fairy tales. And Richard Dawkins can write as many books as you want, but a human being is never going to get beyond the concept of loving fairy tales, and that's beautiful innocence that can be restored, and that's what Jesus, I think, is. Well, let's not go into exegesis of what Jesus was saying with it, but I mean, you can take something of that from what Jesus was saying when he's saying become like little children.
At the very least in principle, absolutely. Yeah, and there's definitely a point there to be made against cold hard evidentialism as well, that says that the only things that are meaningful in life is that which is proven or provable through empirical testing. And of course that's absolute nonsense, because the most important things in life that affect us, and we can see this in our mythologies and our fairy tales, are love and relationship, redemption, etc., etc. And it's just so happens that the Bible concerns these most crucial things.
That's the thing, it's all fairy tales, but it just so happens that, and interestingly, the poet laureate, who will be the former poet laureate, I imagine, when this DVD is heard, he recently stated in an interview in The Guardian that he thinks the Bible should be studied in schools, because all of the stories within it are fundamental to the human condition, and no piece of literature ever written after that has ever, is separate from that. You can't take the Bible away and have any other story in human literature, which is incredible, because it just so happens the text that evangelicals believe is inspired by the word of God, as we do, just so happens to speak to the human condition on every level.
In the best possible way as well. Yeah. And it sounds like this does sound rather sanctimonious, I think, but I think it's necessary in this theological commentary for us to actually state where we're coming from. And I think that's only honest. So it may be that if you're an atheist or or indeed a Christian, they can get annoyed at us as well. Don't we know it? They may be thinking, or you may be thinking, guys, you're just sanctimonious prats. But look, we got to state where we're coming from, and we're going to state what we actually believe. Anything else is dishonest. Wouldn't you agree, Aaron?
Absolutely.
There's so much that we've missed out already. We need to get onto my bit in a second, and it'd be great to express, how and why we put the flowers into my section, but we'll get to that later. I think this is going to be interesting. Sam Sparrow, quickly explain Sam Sparrow.
And the Sam Sparrow thing, it's kind of a popular culture reference, really. The kind of thing that might be one-hit wonder in like a couple of years. But I thought it was important to touch into the zeitgeist of it. And something about how profound it was. Like, I almost got emotional and teary when I heard it after I realised what it was about. And I realised that that's a non-Christian expressing the most profound thoughts in such a concise way. I think it is a really good song, not just because I know it's about God, but people are singing that in clubs, like throwing their arms up in the air. They're declaring the fact that if you're not really here, God,
That's what he was writing about, as the quote.
then all these things that I love about the world, the stars, all the wonderful things, they don't matter. Why would I care about what stars look like or wonder itself if you didn't exist, God? Why on earth would I do that? And he's saying that there's more, there's more to this life. When people tell him that it's just a bunch of matter, there's nothing else. He's like, I don't actually believe you. You can tell me that all you want, but I don't believe you. And I'm not, and he's not a Christian when he's saying it. I don't believe in God, but I kind of can't not believe in God when I really think about it. There's something amazing about that. It's like when the fool says in his heart there is no God. What psalm is that, Nathan? 100. 100. We'll edit in.
Whoa. MA in theology, currently doing a PhD in theology, and another person aiming to do a PhD in theology, and we don't have a clue. It's only because in the heat of the moment we forget. That's my excuse.
That's the thing, and that's the case of what we're trying to get across. That atheism has got this massive voice because of books like The God Delusion that make it this popular voice, and people have started to think, oh, it's default. Atheism first, then I'll consider God. Actually, no. You start with wonder because that is all you have. That's what you have when you're a child, and you don't ever get over that.
We're going to have to break onto suffering, and it's really interesting that we break on that particular scene there as well of the young baby and all these. I mean, we'll talk in the aesthetic commentary as to how he came to these images. It's an interesting story. We're not going to get onto that. However, there is a theological point to be made about why we chose these images and our motivations behind doing so. I remember Aaron as having a real dilemma as to whether or not we should put these images in, not from an aesthetic level, but from a theological level. And it's really true that we can cheapen these images of suffering in trying to express that point. And you were saying to me yesterday, in fact, about the fact that we were coming across these images and thinking, oh wow, this is great material. And then we were convicted of the fact that, this is real stuff. And the decision and the dilemma was primarily concerning whether or not we should include these things. Well, Aaron, what do you think about this whole issue?
Well, it's the same thing. Like, it's a dilemma that people could have. Anybody observing anything, anybody saying, "Look, we're trying to get something across here," but in order to show that, we have to actually go through something. We have to be kind of cold-hearted and objective in some way. And people can easily jump in and go, "How dare you? How dare you think you can be objective in any sense?" Of course, but. Ultimately, these things happen in the world, and if you're trying to communicate something, if you are an evangelist, which every single Christian should be, then obviously not in the Ephesians 4 sense, but that if we're all trying to communicate some kind of message, then we need to use the things of our culture, the things that happen in the world. We need to convey them, and we need to. It's a responsibility, a mandate, even.
Especially when we're dealing theologically, biblically, apologetically, whatever, with suffering. And this was indeed part of the dilemma, because we needed to express the reality of suffering. And I think our concern was maybe this is a bit too strong. And but the thing is that if we're not dealing with the real images, if we're not actually allowing the images to speak for themselves, we're not dealing with the problem of evil, we're dealing with something of our imagination. And that's the force of the problem of evil. And this is what I'm talking about for 7 minutes of my 14-minute monologue. So over half of my monologue is spent defending atheism, because I'm trying to, as we were discussing earlier, trying to get across the best possible argument for atheism. Now, I mean, academically speaking, if you're an atheist and you're listening to this and you're an academic atheist, you probably already know that, we don't go into minute academic details. So let's just put it out there right now. We don't mention the logical problem of evil as articulated by Epicurus or Hume. We don't talk about the evidential. We do mention Hume very briefly, but not in detail. We don't mention the evidential problem of evil as mentioned by William Rowe. And I'm primarily naming these names not to be a pretentious poo, partly for that, but namely because I know it's going back to these things. We both know these things, and yet we're still Christians. And I think that, on a relational note, that has to be taken seriously. Like, we know the evidential problem of evil is probably considered in contemporary philosophy the best argument against the existence of God, and yet we know these things, and yet we still call God sovereign and ruling over suffering. What is that about? And that's kind of what this monologue is trying to get across. And interestingly enough, the evidential problem of evil doesn't say that God can't exist, but that he just is very likely to exist with all this suffering. And it never once, I've not seen a journal article discussing the evidential problem of evil, not once seen a journal article discussing the evidential problem of evil in relationship to the cross. Not once. It's always to the classical God of theism.
It's the concept of God that we talked about in the first monologue as well, about it. Like when that guy says we invented God, it's a sociological construct. We need God as hope, so we invent God. So we're like, if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. That's what they believe. You know, it's raining. Oh, God gave us the rain. Oh, it's sunny. Oh, look, God gave us the sun because He's blessing us or cursing us, however you want to read it. But as you go into Nathan, it's the God of Revelation is the God of Jesus Christ. That's the God.
And it changes the dynamics of the debate fundamentally, but yet they never discuss it.
It's as if they think, oh, there's no point discussing it because it's all religious rubbish and fairy tales anyway.
Without justification, but that's not the point. You see, they borrow the meta-narrative of Christianity, they borrow the Christian story to denounce it, and then when you point out to them that they don't have the Christian story accurately, they go, oh, I'm going to say that's non-justified. Well, you just presupposed it to make your argument. Real bunkum, it really is.
And of course, with Christmas being the time of the incarnation itself, the whole point of Christmas is remember the incarnation. That's why you have the nativity, and we don't always realise how profound the nativity is. What happens in the nativity? Well, God becomes man, and it's something that an atheist almost, I don't think, let's say an atheist, again we're generalising all the time, but we have to say that on some level, when you take a stock response that we might have heard as people who might call ourselves apologists, that's what you get. You get this thing that doesn't consider the incarnation. And how do you sidestep the incarnation? This is the fundamental problem. And at Christmas, we're thinking about the incarnation. That's what these crazy Christian fairy tale people are thinking about. So deal with it if you're an atheist.
And that's basically what this quite long silence is about. For these first 7 minutes, I've discussed the problem of evil, and I've basically said this is a problem. This is a problem. And the real problem of evil is in the fact that we feel like we're alone, that there's no hope and there's no peace, that God has left us, even if he exists. But the point here, as this light begins to emerge, as the God of Revelation is being made known in Jesus Christ suffering on the cross, that actually, relationally speaking, we know for a fact that God hasn't left us, because God revealed himself most intimately in Jesus Christ, and the pinnacle, as it were, of God's revelation in Jesus Christ is his death and resurrection after he turned 33. You know, that this is the real pinnacle, not just of the Bible, but not just of human history, but also of God's history, that we're actually seeing something profoundly intimate about God's self, that he's known as suffering. And again, that has to change fundamentally the dynamics of the philosophical debate about the problem of evil. And that's the point that we're trying to get across. It's not that we're providing a formula like the previous formulas abounded in the philosophical debate, but that we're providing a principle that must govern the way we think about suffering in our world. We can't just think about suffering and God as if God is distant and is ruling things but not really involved. That's not the point of the scriptures. Aaron, do you want to add to that?
I think you said it quite succinctly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so that's the problem. Again, that's just what we've been saying. Yeah, you can't. Concept of God does not exist, and we agree with Richard Dawkins on that case. So if you want to argue for God not existing, then that's fine. I don't believe in the God.
Richard Dawkins' God doesn't exist. I can agree with that. Okay, so yeah, he doesn't exist. This God. Why are we laughing, Aaron?
Because someone just walked in and I just started talking, and then we had to stop it. So we're re-recording now. Anyway, so basically what we were talking about, we recently saw a very interesting public lecture about this concept about how Jesus loves Richard Dawkins for that very reason, that he smashes idols, basically, that he's breaking down the idea of a sociological construct of God, concept of God, and we don't believe in that. We don't, and you know, Jesus wouldn't want you to believe in that, and that's why there's some kind of alliance where you can say, actually, you're fighting our cause here. All we need is for people not to swallow it all. So when he says, I don't want you to believe in a God for the sake of it, in a fatalistic kind of way, oh yeah, there's probably a God because I need kind of a hope in life. That's fine. We don't want you to believe in God because there's hope in that. We want you to believe in God because he revealed himself to you in Jesus Christ. And that is fundamental. You kind of can't get over that. An atheist can't get over the Jesus problem. It's a huge problem. And he's revealed, like, it's the idea that Jesus revealed himself, like God has revealed himself in Jesus. And how do you get over that?
Well, question is, well, the answer is that you don't, I suppose, and that's the idea, that when it comes to this, when it comes to this problem of evil, when it comes to the problem of our suffering, when it comes to the problem of our misery, there's this stark figure in human history called Jesus Christ, who, from atheist to believer, from Muslim to Jew, from Christian to agnostic, everyone has to deal with him. Everyone has to answer his claims. Everyone has to answer his significance, even if you don't believe in the historical accuracy of those claims. And that's the crux for those historicists among you. And you just have to deal with that. And this kind of does connect, and it's quite useful in some ways, because we're really getting not ahead of ourselves, but behind ourselves with the images that are on screen at the moment. You just saw some flowers being laid down. Now, I see quite a lot of significance in this, even though we didn't really plan for it. The flowers being laid down, there's something really interesting when you lay a flower down in the midst of... Aaron, you look like you're about to say something.
I'm just saying, because we haven't actually mastered the final version yet, and we're still in debate as to how the flowers is going to link into your monologues.
It probably still is significant even for the beginning bit. That is, when you put down a flower, you fundamentally change the situation. You fundamentally change the context in which you're putting that flower down. That phone box, that bin, that street, it doesn't look the same, but there's something different about it as well. It's not just aesthetic, but there's something fundamentally different about that street.
The story behind that flower, a flower removed from its kind of original habitat, as it were, in that position where it's somewhere where it shouldn't be, and it makes you ask a question as to why has somebody done that, as well as the fact that it's aesthetically beautiful. And there's something amazing about that can
and there's definitely something, and there's something profoundly symbolic about that. When it, in parallel to the story that we're also trying to put across, that is, God suffers in Jesus Christ, because the human condition is fundamentally changed, theologically speaking, biblically speaking, after God makes himself man. The human condition, the human situation, the human problem, so to speak, is fundamentally changed after God revealed himself in Jesus Christ, because now humanity has been touched by grace and by God himself. So there's something profoundly symbolic in that laying of the flower, even if we do choose to cut out if you're watching this and you don't see flowers being put down in my monologue, don't worry about this, but they still link. Okay, we're now on to the synthesis. We've got to move on. Aaron, explain the problem behind the synthesis. Explain really briefly, because there is going to be a video about the synthesis where we'll explain the problem in depth, but in summary, what is our problem with the synthesis?
Fundamentally, as we were talking about, we had a big 2-hour debate last night in which we got out Bible commentaries, and we're looking at Romans 1. Basically, it's on the fundamental disparate nature of our two monologues in the thesis that they're kind of the way that they talk about the world. So you could take my monologue and use it as an articulation of the gospel. You could also take Nathan's, and they would be separate. And our problem almost was that we both came to this saying this is what we want to do, and they're both so different. And we're like, well, why don't we put them together and see how it works? Because we've never seen a gospel of beauty next to a gospel of suffering. They're too different. They're two opposite ends, and we wondered how we were going to do that. So basically,
it was brave. It was definitely brave. Like, as we did say at the beginning, no one's done this before. Now we're kind of realizing why.
Yeah, brave / arrogant, and basically we're dealing with questions about God's revelation that it's very difficult to completely pin down, and we're trying to almost say that we can answer, certainly 400-500 years worth of Protestant scholarship.
Yeah, and clashing with Catholic scholarship, and within Protestant. And basically, the issue is this: if these terms aren't familiar for you, just let them wash over you. For those who are, you'll probably geekily get something from it. This is the whole debate. It's framed between natural law, the natural theology and revelational theology. It's framed between Aquinas and Barth. It's framed between it's got Calvin in there too. It's got the whole Reformed debate as to where we know or how we know about God. Do we know about him through nature, and if so, how and why? Do we know about him through his word, his scripture, his revelation, his self-witness? How and why, if that's the case? And the conflict, the tension between those two is touched upon in our synthesis. And essentially, that's why we failed, because this is one of the biggest debates for the last 500 years of church history, if not longer. And we try and summarize it and conquer it. Well, we didn't try to conquer it.
We tried to wrap it up, and that's how it sounds.
In 5 minutes.
In the synthesis, it sounds like we're wrapping it up. So we've got all these pithy sayings, and they're all true sayings. And the thing is, people who've watched this don't actually have a problem with the synthesis. I imagine theologians would, but the average person, lay person, whatever you want to say, wouldn't have a problem. Like, oh, I like I like the ending, I like the pictures, and I like the music, and worked around. What you were saying is very true, and made me think about things. But actually, what we've tried to do is we're trying to say God exists because of beauty, and also God exists only because He revealed Himself expressly in Jesus Christ. The Barthian take. Then how do you reconcile them? How do you as you said, do you say that mountain is beautiful, therefore God exists, or do you say I know about Jesus Christ now, therefore God exists? And this is the debate. And how do we reconcile the two of them? Have we reconciled beauty and suffering together? There is beauty in the world, it is beautiful. There is also suffering in the world. And,
how does suffering relate to that? I think it's apt, though, that the images say more about what we're trying to say than our words do. And there's something really theologically quite profound in that, but only geeks would be able to get that, maybe. I don't know. But I mean, it's the fact that background, for example, we'll go into it more in the aesthetic commentary, but it's crap. It's not, it's not crap. It's beauty arising from what could be seen as crap. It's beauty coming from an oil refinery, which during the day is horrible, but at night it turns fantastic. And in the night, there's goodness and there's hope. Is another theological theme that's quite appropriate.
Yeah,
but
and the thing is, as you said, the profundity of it. There's something about this that is messy, and maybe our failure is that we tried to wrap it up, and it is a paradoxical thing. I completely, in a sense, I believe in both, in a way. It's a very strange, paradoxical thing. I believe in the beauty. I don't believe in natural theology on its own. That's kind of a very dangerous way to get going. That's how you get the sociological construct of God, because you're like, well, look at the world, therefore God, rather than look at Christ, therefore God. And this, in some senses, there's a kind of a messy distance in between, and almost like it's difficult to actually pin down in black and white box up terms exactly where the answer lies. We can't do it in those kind of, yes, what is the answer, here is the answer. It's a very much more of a tension thing. It's a tension between these two, and you definitely can't forget either. You can't read Romans 1 where it says the heavens declare the glory of God and completely dismiss natural theology, and you can't equally just have natural theology without the idea that only God is revealed only in Jesus Christ, or most expressly in Jesus Christ. So.
I mean, just in case you're wondering, yes, we do know that the video has finished now, and that you are watching black or an image of some sort.
Profound.
Yes, how profound. But we are going to have to come to an end, I'm afraid, Aaron. We could talk for ages. I kind of feel like we've not really done the theology justice that much, but I hope in some way that we've kind of touched on some major themes, some major issues, and given it some justice. Aaron, what would you say what would you say that Heather represents? Why did we do Heather? Why did we use Heather?
Essentially, well, as I was talking about earlier, she's almost the carrier of beauty. So maybe she's the Christ.
Maybe, okay. And what was the point? In summary, in Précis, what was your section about?
It was a retort to the atheist conception that God doesn't exist because it's an infantile, childlike thing to believe in God.
And we've already discussed the laying down of the flowers and the significance of the laying down of the flowers, that is beauty arising out of nowhere, but also the fact that that beauty changes fundamentally the context in which it arose. My section is essentially responding to atheistic charges that God can't exist in suffering, but saying that no, the real problem of evil is that when we suffer, we feel like we're alone, that there's no hope, there's no peace. But actually, the God of revelation, revealed in Jesus Christ, fundamentally changes the dynamics of the philosophical debate and shows us that we can posit God's existence in the midst of suffering because he himself has suffered it, has suffered through it as well. What would you say the attempt was behind the synthesis? If we could do it again, what would you want to get from it?
I think we'd be a bit more tentative with the way we approached it, and the only problem is, as we were discussing yesterday, perhaps we shouldn't have done a synthesis. Perhaps we shouldn't even have tried to put these two together, and we should have said, here are two very different approaches to expressing the gospel in this culture, both attacking, in a sense, the same problem, the same atheistic problem. And maybe there shouldn't be a synthesis in a sense, or maybe we just need to work a lot harder, and it might take us 20 years to have a synthesis. But it doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means that at where we are at the moment, it's a very it's PhD level stuff. So perhaps we need to work a lot more on it, and
Towards a PhD.
well, towards a PhD. But genuinely, like it could be a PhD thesis to try and combine these two, because this is the problem that you have in life. You have the concept of Eden, and then you have the concept of the fall. And how do we reconcile those two together? How do you say that God, has God just made the world and left it and that's it? Or is there some redemption there for actually the beauty of the world itself? And as I said, the Heather thing is a nice way as well to almost encapsulate what we're both saying, because not only is it that she's spreading, Christ, spreading beauty in who he is, the resurrection as well gives you hope. When you're walking along the road and you see a flower, there's some hope there for humanity, and that's the same hope that you get in Christ. That's not complete. That sounds like a vague, trite link, but it really isn't, because fundamentally the human condition is answered by the resurrection. I'm a literature student as well as a theology student, and the whole point of literature is to glory in how dark the human condition is and how confused we are. And actually, the resurrection is something incredible. So you can still say, yes, there's sadness and darkness, and talk about it. It's actually interesting in some senses and confusion, but in the resurrection, there's something very powerful, glorious, hopeful, light.
I think that's a brilliant place to end. That is the theological commentary. If you want to hop it over, presumably to the menu, we've not made it yet, but there will be a menu.
Prophetic menu.
There will be a prophetic menu. And if you want to hop over there's going to be an aesthetic one. The difference between these two, as we stated at the beginning, is this one has been more about, hopefully, about illuminating some of the theological intentions behind the video. The other one is purely about how we made it, why we chose the aesthetic choices that we did. So I hope that you've been blessed. I hope that you've enjoyed it. I hope that we're not too pretentious for you. And and God bless.
Ditto.
Take care, folks. Goodbye.